All right, hello everyone. It's 3 minutes after, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining. I'm very excited to be introducing Dr. Mika Tosca for our first seminar of the year. Mika received her BS in Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Connecticut, and then her PhD from a place you might have heard of, our Earth System Science Department here at UC Irvine in 2012. Since then, she's worked for NASA JPL, mainly on the Miser Plume Project, and now as an assistant professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So now I'll hand it over to Mika to talk to us about the intersections of art and science for solving the climate crisis.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for the invitation. Nice to see everyone virtually. I'm so sad that I can't be there in person. I miss Irvine and UC Irvine dearly, and so I am really honored and thrilled to be giving this presentation to you. So I am going to share my screen so that we can start. So the title of my talk is Reimagining Futures, Collaborations Between Artists, Designers, and Scientists as a Roadmap to Solving the Climate Crisis. This is probably a different kind of talk than maybe you're used to in the department. And so I'm really curious for feedback when we're done, either today or in the future. On what you all think of that. And that's because I am a faculty, I'm an assistant professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which means that I teach science to art students, to art kids, not liberal arts, but arts. So like sculptures and painters and that sort of thing. And in my time at SAIC, I've been thinking about ways that scientists and artists can collaborate, not just in sort of the straightforward way, which is proper sort of improved communication of climate change, but also in an improvement in the way in which scientists conduct science by collaborating with the artists and thinking about the art making process. And so I want to start with a quote from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Some of you may have read this summer, as it recently made it to the New York Times bestseller list for the first time, about 30 years too late, but you know, it happens. And the quote, I think, really captures kind of the motivation for why I approach this work and why I think it's so important that we do this. So I'll just read it. The world is full of painful stories. Sometimes it seems as though there aren't any other kind, and yet I found myself thinking how beautiful that glint of water was through the trees. And so the themes for this work and the title of this, Reimagining Futures, are thinking about what the next world looks like, what the post climate change, what the post climate crisis, what our future world looks like. And I'm constantly sort of reminded by and draw upon themes from work like the sci-fi of Octavia Butler and other Afrofuturists who have thought about this world building of future worlds. And so you'll see how we get there. But before we get to the meat of it, normally I do this presentation in person. So we'll see how this goes over Zoom. But I want to start with asking you all, what is nature? When you hear the word nature, what do you think is nature? First of all, are you a part of nature or are you separate from it? I obviously can't ask for a show of hands, but I would imagine that most of you would argue that you're a part of nature. You're a person, you breathe, you're an animal. And so therefore, we are inherently part of nature. And then I would ask you all to list some words and things that you would identify as being natural. And you might say trees, or the sky, or grass, or rocks. And then I would ask you to list some words and things that you associate with the word unnatural. And you might say, capitalism, and concrete, and plastic. Those might be things that you associate with the word unnatural. So there's a cognitive dissonance here. We often view ourselves as being a part of nature, and yet when asked to describe things that are unnatural, we almost always say things that are created by humans. And so we've definitely separated ourselves practically from nature. And yet, yeah, and so we've separated ourselves from nature. And yet, I would argue that this fundamental separation is part of the problem, right? Because we need to reimagine a world as one where humanity and nature coexist, where we are actually part of nature, really part of nature, and we can redefine the boundaries of what is natural and what is unnatural. And I think this is how we can ultimately get to solutions to the climate crisis. Which brings me to the role of aesthetics and art and design and creative output, right? So I saw this poll, actually, and I shoved this in here last night. I saw this poll by Pew, which asked Americans how they view scientists. Almost 90% of Americans view scientists as intelligent. That's awesome. That's good. We got something going for us. But only 54% of Americans see scientists as good communicators. So this fundamental disconnect between the public trusting scientists to be smart and the public viewing us as good communicators. In fact, 43% of Americans view scientists as socially awkward. And so I think that these are all part of the same issue, which is that scientists are just notoriously not great at communicating the science that they're working on. Which brings us to the idea of aesthetics. And so I'm just going to try to shrink myself. Oops. So how do I move my screen? My mouse is gone. Okay. Anyway, this quote from David George Haskell's notes about ecological aesthetics really captures, I think, kind of the essence of the problem. Hang on one second. I'm sorry. My like Zoom window, I'm like in the way. Okay, I'm just gonna shrink it down. This is much better. So the quote goes, once we collectively have an integrated sense of aesthetics, we can begin to discern what is beautiful and what is broken about a place. And from there, I believe, we can begin to form an objective or near objective foundation for ethical discernment. Answers emerge from the community of life itself, future through human experience and consciousness. The sort of layman's terms interpretation of this is that human beings are drawn to things that are aesthetic. We love well-designed, aesthetic, artistic, even creative things. And so connecting with the human imagination is such an integral part of not only communicating science, but also doing science. And so this is all really, the challenge of doing this with respect to climate change is really embodied in this book by Timothy Morton called Hyperobjects, where he defines climate change as a hyperobject being an abstracted object. It's big, it's temporally large, it's spatially large. It's difficult to really understand what is climate change as a physical sort of, as an object, right? As an aesthetic. It is an aesthetic and it is an object. But it's difficult to grasp because of its size and its sort of breadth. And so we call it Timothy Morton at least calls it a hyperobject. And so while all people, and especially all scientists, encounter abstractions in our work, and climate change is sort of an abstracted object, right? Artists and designers in particularly intelligently address abstraction and create objects every day. They're really good at this. They're really good at tapping into the human imagination and connecting the human desire, the human sort of captivation by aesthetics. And so that brings me to some of the work that I want to show, some of the work that some of my students do. So I teach at an art school, which is really awesome because my students are so talented. My students and colleagues actually are so talented. And so For my main class that I teach, which is called Earth's Changing Climate, for their final project, I ask them all to think about climate change, think about the things we discussed in the class, and then represent their research, their final research project, as both a paper and then as an aesthetic artifact, as a creative artifact, a representation of what they're doing. And so I want to start with this one because it truly is my favorite. And it's titled Climate Deniers on Vacation. It's a print by Katie Wittenberg. And you can see it's, first of all, really wonderful to look at. There are some hilarious people depicted here. Scott Pruitt, the Koch brothers, I can't even remember his name now, but the former CEO of Exxon. They're sitting on polar bears, and behind them is what looks like a mountain chain in relief, but is actually a depiction of the, I believe it is the temperature record of Earth, right? So represented as like sort of an abstracted mountain range. So we're getting a lot of information, we're getting a lot of engagement, we're getting a lot of aesthetic engagement with this work. It doesn't have to say that much, but it does a lot. Here's another one, which I have hanging in my house actually, called The Not So Great Wave. It's depicting an inverted great wave, which is a very famous silver screen print. But of course, the colors are abstracted, and there is a tin can representing sort of human pollution, human influence on the environment in this wave, right? So that the great wave in 2020, so to speak, might look like this. Another really cool and interesting thing about this work is that it's the process that NOAA used to make this this print is known as suicide printing, where you carve, you carve a section out, you put the ink in it, you print it, and then that's it. You don't get to go back. And then you do another one, and you do a different color, and you move on until you've reached the end, right? So you don't get a do-over. And so that's like, that has analogies and metaphors to the climate crisis as well. Here are two more. I'm going to show you lots because I just think that they're amazing. Here on the left, we have a climate change quilt by one of my students, Mika, and they're showing here kind of the intersection of climate change and sort of the Anthropocene and environmental disaster, and how that is related with and interacts with various things in our world, like gender identity, for example, and access to resources, and how those are both related to each other and related to climate change and natural disasters, right? Loss of resources, geographical location, denial of aid. It's all done as a quilt, because we talk in my class about how the greenhouse effect is sort of like putting a blanket over the earth. So the depiction of a quilt is really important to communicating the message that Mika was going for here. On the right, we have what looks like a Nestle plastic water bottle, but it's made from glass by my student Kendall. And they actually used the plastic water bottle that this mold was made from to form this totally useless koozie, this white koozie, over the top, right? It's a critique on our use of plastic, our overuse of plastic, and how that's contributing to our reliance on fossil fuels, the climate crisis, etc. Art, to me, is more than just prints and paintings and sculptures. It's also a process as well. And so on the left is a final project by my student Mandy, and it's just a global warming rant, a rant about global warming on Snapchat. And she had a whole like 20 snap story about global warming and why it's important that we all recognize this. Most of my students are Gen Z, and so Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok and these types of things really resonate with that generation of folks. And so this is a great way to sort of capture the attention of a different generation, right? We're going after different demographics here. And then on the right is a really great video, which I don't think I have time necessarily to play, but it's called Cake for Birds and Mothers. And in Chicago, we have an endangered species of bird that nests along the coastline of Lake Michigan. And its habitat is being destroyed by both climate change. The lake level has been rising and falling pretty dramatically in the last decade. Also, the city itself and the surrounding suburbs have sort of eaten away at the habitat. And so my student actually made a cake for the birds with seeds that she did the research and like sort of learned what the diet of these birds was and why they might like this cake. And then she made this honestly really cool video where she left the cake out all day and filmed it, and some of the birds came to eat it, and it was sort of like a love letter to this endangered species of bird. We talk a lot in my classes about what it means that humans have identified endangered species and why that's both important and also potentially like sort of a vanity project, and how that plays with climate change and stuff. So this video I really like, and if any of you want to see it, you can message me and I will send you a shot of it. Here's another example. It's a really bad picture. I'm unfortunately not an artist and a photographer myself, but it's an untitled piece. It's a poem about severe weather in the Midwest and how severe weather is likely to increase due to climate change, specifically tornadic activity and other things. And so my student Ethan wrote this poem, which actually can only be read if the lights are off and you're using a flashlight, because it's been written in sorry, you're using a black light because it's been written in a specific type of ink that only black light can see. And so of course, when there's a severe storm, one of the most common things that happens is that you lose power. So it's kind of tapping into multiple sort of aesthetic imaginations to tell us a really an interesting story. Finally, we have two more images here. We have one on the left, which is images of a coral reef, but they've been corrupted. The JPEGs have been corrupted. So the title of this piece is Negative Images. And this piece was actually made in collaboration with one of my students' 7th grade classes that she was shadowing and interning for. They actually taught her how to corrupt these JPEG images. And of course, this is a very literal sort of aesthetic interpretation of how our coral reefs are suffering under climate change. And then finally on the right, we have a cartoon of how Venice is flooding due to a number of human influences, one of them, of course, being sea level rise. And I actually also have this, this hanging in my apartment. So one of the really great things about being able to teach art students is that you get a lot of cool artwork hanging in your apartment and your office. I also have one of my students made corrupted the recording of Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem at 1969 Woodstock. And I'm not going to play it because I don't think I have time, but again, if you want to message me, I can send you the link for it. But he took the atmospheric record of carbon dioxide concentrations, and he fit a sinusoid to that, and then layered it on top of Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem in 1969. And it creates, by the end, this really like dysphonic, dystopic sounding finale, which is kind of the point, right? It starts out the national anthem and it ends with just sort of a cacophony of noise. Again, sort of trying to very, you know, aesthetically convey the problem with rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this brings me to kind of the main point that I want to make here. So we've talked a lot about how aesthetics can be used as a way to communicate the climate crisis. We know that scientists are not always the best communicators. Art is something that can be used as a tool for better communication. I also, in working with artists and in thinking about the links between science and art, I've also been thinking about how artists can not only communicate science better, but can also help scientists do science better. And this is where I sometimes lose the scientists in the audience. So stick with me. So we've got this depiction of the scientific method. I know it's not perfect. No, the scientific method is not this linear process. We all sort of learn that. But just to simplify things, we have kind of a hypothesis, which involves questioning and proposing and imagining things. And then we have the experimental phase, and then we have a conclusion, possibly a theory. The design and art making process is similar to the scientific method in that there is an ideation phase where you're exploring and you're imagining outcomes. There's a prototyping phase, which is kind of analogous to the experimental phase where you're testing and you're observing, and you're proposing changes, and you're analyzing your artifact that you're producing. And then you have a refinement and a delivery phase where you're polishing something and you actually deliver a completed artifact, whether it be a work of art or something that you've designed. What the design process and the art making process, a step that they also contain that the scientific method, in my experience anyway, doesn't always contain, is this first component, which is the understanding, empathizing, learning, listening, translation, talking to humans, right? Thinking about human responses to the work. How do humans need this? Do humans want this? How will humans engage with this? What is this going to do to the human imagination, right? Everything in our world is designed. There are some things that are well designed, and there are some things that are not well designed. And the things that are well designed, probably the designer and the art maker and the creative spend more time in this initial phase, understanding and empathizing and talking to actual human beings before they moved on to the hypothesis or the ideation phase of this. And so I would argue that if scientists worked with artists in this way and kind of incorporated this human-centered process, we may actually find that solutions to the climate crisis are not only easier to communicate, but they're also actually easier to solve. And one way that I kind of approached this was I worked with the designer at JPL. While I was at SAIC, I was working with a designer at JPL. So I want to talk about that project really briefly, and I just want to make sure that I still have enough time. Yes. So the motivation for this project came from my experience participating on the Oracle's field campaign, the NASA Oracle's field campaign in Namibia in 2016. And while I was in Namibia, I had the opportunity also to travel to Zambia, where I spoke with some local farmers who and other community members who engaged with burning and fire, because I was looking at fire aerosols specifically. And one quote from a guy named Chris Kyanesha really stands out to me and still stands out to me this day. We were talking about climate change and we were talking about all of these sorts of things. And this is a paraphrase, but he essentially said, in 41 years, I never left Zambia, but these farms now are so dry this time of year. And it was, when I was there, it was September. It was late September. He said, it doesn't rain anymore. We used to have rain in October and September. Now it's November. I don't know why, but we need water. It's so dry. I guess it's global warming. But all I know is that we need water in Lake Kariba or we won't survive, right? So we've got all these words to describe the climate crisis. We've got a lot of science in the global north that describes the climate crisis. But how much time do we actually spend sort of engaging with folks who are sort of on the front lines of this type of thing? And so that was the motivation for me thinking about how art and science can combine to sort of produce a better product, so to speak. And so I'm going to be talking briefly about this project, which I did, which of course involves wildfire. For those of you that knew me at UC Irvine, you know that, and when I went to JPL, that for a decade or more, I studied wildfire, specifically aerosols from wildfire. And I obviously can't start a segment on wildfire without showing some work from one of my students. So here is a print of a California wildfire that one of my students made, my student Dakota Sherman made. Very apocalyptic looking, but also really aesthetically beautiful, captivating. So this figure from a Sally Archibald 2017 paper looking at anthropogenic fire landscapes indicates where all of the fires on the planet are that are caused by humans. That's what all the blue dots are, right? And so during my time at JPL, I worked on a project for multiple years where, and I actually worked with two students who are now in this department, Matt and Robert, who really were instrumental in helping me with this project. We basically looked at every fire on the globe, and using the MISR multi-angle imaging spectroradiometer satellite, we're able to see how high in the atmosphere the smoke coming from those fires goes, where it ends up in the atmosphere. And so there is a software program that was built and refined at JPL, which I had a hand in designing as well, which digitizes smoke plumes and then using a stereoscopic algorithm computes how high in the atmosphere those smoke plumes actually are. One of my first papers that I ever wrote as a grad student at JPL was actually using this software. So when I got to JPL, we set out to create the MISR Plume Height Project, where we basically found every fire that we could see on the globe, every smoke plume. We digitized how high in the atmosphere the smoke plume went, and we created this global database. I think there's like 5 years worth of fire plumes in that database. Every plume on Earth, how high in the atmosphere those go. In my opinion, this is a very valuable data set. It tells us a lot of information about where these aerosols are going, how high in the atmosphere they're going, has implications for transport, for atmospheric transport of aerosols, which can affect cloud formation, it can affect the radiation budget, and ultimately it can affect surface and atmospheric temperatures and the climate. And so while I was at JPL, we designed this website where we dumped all of those plumes. And so you can go to this website, or you could go to this website, and you could download any plume for any fire across the globe. Now, I'm talking to what I assume are mostly scientists, and so we might all be looking at this website. So this is what the website used to look like. And we might be thinking, it's okay. If I show this to a group of artists at the school I work at, for example, they're like, what the hell is this? It's very confusing. It's not user-friendly. It makes no sense. It's really difficult to navigate. And so the end result was that really nobody was using these data. Nobody was using this data set that I collaborated with multiple undergraduate students at the time to build over the course of 5 years. Very much a passion project for me. And so thinking about the intersection of art and science, I wrote a grant with some people at JPL where we were able to work with a design team to redesign this website. So in working with the design team, I got insight into how the design process actually works, how the art making process actually works, right? Per the sort of slide that I showed 2 slides ago, with this sort of human engagement and then ideation, prototyping, etc. Right? And so I'm just going to walk you through the process that we use to kind of give you some insight into how this both parallels and also is slightly different from the scientific method. So the first step, of course, is the contextual inquiry, understanding the people and the problem. And contextual inquiry is a design technique in which people are studied in their context of action in order to build a clear understanding of what they do and what they need. So for this particular project, with the MISR team, this entailed multiple interview sessions, discussions, and workflow demonstrations with scientists and the designers themselves. I also should note that a lot of this work and a lot of these slides, I owe a lot to my collaborator and my colleague, Adrian Galvin, who once we finished this project, actually graduated with his master's in design and is now a full-time designer at the Jet Propulsion Lab. So that's awesome. So here's an example. I just show this because I think Adrian is like an incredible illustrator. These are some of his notes that he took during the contextual inquiry of this data set, of the MISR satellite, of this, how the smoke plumes work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So then we move from the contextual inquiry to the ideation sketching, to the sort of hypothesis phase. Like, what is this product going to look like? What are we doing here? What are we after? So this first step, right, just like the hypothesis step in the scientific method, is sort of a low-cost, intuitive way to iterate on ideas, create artifacts and hypotheses and other things that the team can respond to and have helpful conversations around. Many ideas are created and thrown away during this process, which saves the team effort. Very similar to, I think, sort of the hypothesis sort of part of the scientific method, right? So here's an example of the ideation phase. This is, you know, the designers thinking through what this updated website should look like. What can make it more user-friendly, more conducive to performing quality science. So then there's a lot of collaboration involved in the design process. So here's a picture of myself talking with one of our designers during this collaboration phase, right? Where we did a lot of, well, the designers anyway, did a lot of co-designing with scientists, showing sketches, sharing ideas, allowing us to give ideas to the designers of what we need, what we use, creating this novel visualization, and working in close collaboration so that we can all make sure that we're on the right track, that we're all getting the result that we want. Then we move into the prototyping phase, right? So here's an example of sort of the first paper prototype, and then there's a testing session. So it's very similar to what you might do during the experimental phase of the scientific method with data analysis, collecting data, analyzing data, returning back maybe to the field to collect more data, or rerunning the model with a slightly different perturbation, et cetera, right? Then we move from sort of paper prototypes to this digital prototype, and we hired a computer designer, computer programmer, to help us design a digital prototype. Here's the first digital prototype. Then we go back to the paper. We do a second paper prototype. And when I say we, I mean the designers. Then we have another testing session, lots of collaboration here, lots of human involvement. Finally, we have another digital prototype. And then we get to our results from this project. These are our actual results. So here's the, just to remind you, here's the website originally. It's not great. And that's a was muted. Okay. Sorry, I think I was briefly muted by accident. Reminding you, here's the website originally. Not great. Probably not conducive to performing good science. One of the problems with this is that the website was so cumbersome to use. It wasn't aesthetic. It wasn't user-friendly. That there was a long sort of lag time between, oh, I want to do this research, this question, and then, like, do I actually have the data? Can I obtain the data to do it, right? That's an unnecessary step that art and design can solve. And so here is what that website looks like now. Of course, this is a beautiful aesthetic rendering, but this is what the home screen of the website looks like. So when you log on to that website, you're immediately presented with visualizations of where all the plumes are. You can visualize XY plots that look at fire radiative power with relation to the maximum plume height, for example. You can look at pie charts of where the plumes for a certain time period are located, whether they're in Africa or South America or Boreal Eurasia. You can look at a visual map, like a map of Africa, for example, which is depicted in the right corner here, right? So this is all just, you go to that website and you can log in, and instead of seeing, you know, this, you see this instead, and you get a lot of information right away. I get no information from this, except that there might be some plumes, and this is how they're divided up into these various colored geographical regions. Now I look at this, I can see, for example, in this depiction, you know, how many plumes, for example, are located in the Sudan based on the coloring of the bars. I can look at the XY plots. I can subset data that I want to eventually download to then do, interrogate some scientific hypothesis on. I can bin the data by biome, and I can zoom in and out. And as I do that, the data rebins itself, so I get a really good initial look at the type of data that I'm after, right? So you can see how this would ultimately result in, possibly better science being done, because we're skipping that step of like, what is this website? What data do I want? How do I want to download it? What are the questions that I want to ask with it? What do I want to do? Now I can log in and I can just play around with this interface, and I can ask questions. I can ask more questions. I can ask maybe better questions. And I've skipped that cumbersome step of like, where are the data and how do I download them? And what do they look like, right? And so we thought to explore this, and this work is still ongoing. It hasn't been published yet, but ultimately we will be publishing this. TBD, where it's kind of difficult to find a journal that will accept collaboration sort of between designers, artists, and scientists. But we did a controlled environment study with a few users of these data. And Adrian created this insight process map, right, where he basically just watched what happened when we used the new website. And, as you can see here, he's kind of binned it into periods where I was just clicking around, or when one of the users was just clicking around, to when we asked a question out loud, like, oh, maybe we can use these data to answer this question. And then we came up with a hypothesis, and then when we arrived at sort of a paper topic that we might be able to use. And so what we want to do is talk about this controlled environment study, right, in relation to how this plays out using the old website, which, my guess, and I think all of our guesses, is that the new website, the new aesthetic website, not only looks prettier and is more aesthetic and is easier to engage with, but it also leads us down a path of conducting better science. That art and design have actually helped push us in the direction of asking better questions, asking more questions, and ultimately performing better science. So I think that art is really valuable, not only for communicating science, but also for doing better science. And so this is my last slide. I always like to maintain optimism with all of my students. I think it's really important during these times to maintain optimism, to convey hope. And so I want to return to the sort of sentiments from that first quote from Parable of the Sower. And I want to urge you all watching, and for anyone really, that this isn't the end of the world, right? It's just the end of this world that we've created, this world of climate crisis, this world of rising fascism, which may or may not be related to the climate crisis. So it's not the end of that world, it's just the end of this world. And this draws on the work of like Frantz Fanon and other Afrofuturists and his contemporaries. And I like to argue that we have a radical and revolutionary opportunity to make the next world, right, a better, brighter, more equitable one. But if we don't first imagine the future that we want, if we don't tap into human imagination, then we will never have the future that we deserve. And we must, in order to get to this future, in order to build this next world, we must incorporate diverse voices. And this includes artists. And this ultimately will help us get to the next world. So that is what I have. Thank you very much. I guess maybe I'll take questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mika. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions. There are a lot of people here, so please use the raise hand feature. And I can call on you if you click on the participants button at the bottom, and then go over. You should be able to raise your hand on the right or type in the chat. And I also real quick will advertise and put in the chat. We'll have a discussion after this seminar. We'll start at about 2 o'clock about being queer in geosciences. So feel free to join us for that too. I see Venice has a question. Go ahead, Venice.
Thanks, Mika, for a very interesting talk. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and I wasn't there from the beginning. I enjoyed it, and I have some collaborations now with the arts department. And so I'm very, very much interested in what you're talking about here. The question I have for you is that when you redesign, or when you design, whether a website, when you use these tools, these aesthetic tools, whether it be a website or a piece of art, do you generally think of a specific audience, or it's just generic with the assumption that all humans love aesthetic things? So that's the first one. But also, as a follow-up question, have you had any I would like to understand, to have an idea of your responses from policymakers. I mean, given the fact that in the times that we live in, and from my own experience, something that might be looked at as positive might have a backlash. So you can have, as you know, we have sometimes desirable consequences of climate change, not always undesirable, and someone may use that against us to say climate change is good. So I would like to know, do you think about those different audiences, and how do you incorporate that in your work?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and it's a super important one too. I think I was just on a panel a couple of weeks ago with a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe. Some of you may know her. And she talks a lot about how communication of the climate crisis is really audience dependent, right? You have to meet your audience where they are, instead of telling them what you think they want to hear. So absolutely, I think when artists, designers, makers, creatives are creating work, they are absolutely thinking about their audiences. And that is, yeah, plays into this work as well. So our audience for this website that I showed was scientists, actually, right? So we were designing that website for use by scientists. So that's a little different than the artwork that my students are creating, which is to be used to sort of communicate climate change to a general audience. I think I often give them, the prompt is like, you're trying to communicate to a high school audience or something, or an undergraduate college audience, like, what is climate change? What is this thing that you're researching? So when I'm at the art school, we have to do critiques of artwork. All the faculty do, where we basically look at art that students are making and we talk about it for like 30 minutes. And it's a critique, and they get kind of graded on it. It's like a whole thing. And one of the questions that inevitably always gets asked is, who is your audience? And why are you making this for them? Why, or not? Why do you not care about them? Right? Because there's sort of like two sides to that coin. So absolutely, audience is like very, 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 very important, and it's definitely a consideration for these types of projects. Yeah, great question. Thanks. Also, I'm just reading through the chat, and someone asked if what data visualization software was used, and it was written from scratch. Yeah, it was. We had a computer scientist who wrote it from scratch. So I just want to clarify that.
Great. Yeah, there's a couple other questions in the chat from Dylan about making it more accessible for people not in the art scene. For example, coal miners don't often frequent the Brooklyn art scene.
So this is why this is a really important question. I think, like, again, audience is important here. While I was at JPL and now at SAIC, two separate people were working on a project to bring sea level data to indigenous communities in the Arctic on their phone, on an app, right? And so this is really important information for indigenous communities who use the Arctic Ocean for hunting whales, which is a way in which they sustain their livelihoods. And because of the retreat of sea ice earlier in the year, which they typically would, walk out on to go spear whales, that sea ice is no longer there, right? They're really engaged with what's happening to the Arctic sea ice. And so you might not think of this as art, but I think of it as art. I think of it as an aesthetic, sort of a scientist making that app. It's not going to be, it's not going to achieve necessarily the same end goal if there's no collaboration with or focus on who's going to be using it and why are they going to be using it? Why are they engaging with it, right? And so I agree, like making high art, making fine art is not always going to work in this context, right? But art comes in many different forms. I had one student who, for their final project, they picked up trash in Grant Park on Lake Michigan and filmed it, right? And while they were doing it, they engaged with people who were walking by, who were visiting the park, and talked about climate change, talked about the Anthropocene, talked about all these things. So we might not think of that as art necessarily, but I can guarantee you that the art world thinks of that as art. And I think of it as art because art is just, I mean, it's very cliche to say, but art is sort of anything, right? It's this sort of like something that captures the human imagination in important ways, in sort of visceral ways. And so, yeah, I agree. Like having a fine art exhibit is not always going to be enthralling to coal miners in West Virginia, but perhaps some other embodiment of art or some other aesthetic representation will. And so that's really important. It goes hand in hand with the audience question. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Mika, this is Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
I do exist. Hi. One of the things you opened your talk with was the question of, are humans separate from or identical with or part of nature? And, I wanted to ask you, because your perspective seemed to be that, of course we are. I wanted to confess that I had the opposite response to your question, and it was that I don't feel, especially in the constructed environment, a part of nature very often.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it one of the tragedies of civilization that we are so distant and so oftenly distant from nature that we don't understand climate change to the extent that those who are still living on the land do understand and feel and resonate with changes in the seasonality of the environment that they live in. I think that played out very much in your redesign of the website, how you went from that rectilinear, impossible Mercator projection that like no human being has ever seen. It's completely, a projection is the right word for it. It's not even it can never really be seen by human eyes in reality. And you've changed it, and your opening screen now is full of rounded corners and aesthetic judgments, and you have that stereoscopic point of view, which kind of re-encapsulates the data set itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? The stereo vision of Miser. So I think that what you've demonstrated is how wide a leap it would be for us who are so far, so often from nature to kind of get to that perspective, and why a great web designer or artist would work so well with scientists.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I may have maybe not fully kind of explained. I agree with you completely. I do think most humans like to say that they're part of nature because they hold this like mythical idealized sort of like relationship that they have with nature. But I do think in our practical lives, we are very separate from nature. And that's actually the issue, right? Is that we think we're part of it, but we're not actually. Like we don't really engage with it. We don't really know about it. We don't really know what's going on. And so we do have to get back to actually being a part of it, right? So it's like exactly what you're saying. Yeah. There's typically when I ask this question like to a room full of people, like 95% of them will say that they are part of nature, which is interesting to me because like I would say in practical material realities, most humans don't actually think that they're part of nature. I mean, I'm sitting in this like apartment. I've got all these plants behind me, but they're all in pots. Like, what is what is nature, like what is my relationship with nature, right? So it's like it's a very complicated thing, but you're absolutely right in that recapturing our imagination and bringing us kind of back to nature, which we fundamentally want to be a part of, then that could go a long way philosophically to, like, you know, reconnecting us with the climate crisis. I have my students read the book The End of Nature by Bill McKibben. I don't know if anyone in here has read it. Hopefully people have read it. It's a great book. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. And he talks about this problem in philosophical sort of framing quite extensively. Yeah.
Well, if we felt we were part of nature, then perhaps we would act more responsibly. So it's a really important message that you're sending.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Can I piggyback on that thought and bring it closer to science? What are your views on the possibility of evolving the epistemology, you know, of science, of scientific thinking, so that we also, just like we're talking about the disconnect between humans and nature, we can also talk a little bit about the disconnect between science and society. Science, and as you know, of course we try to eliminate any source of bias, but over the years we have been questioning whether or not it's better to just embrace that we are, as scientists, humans, and by default filled with biases and preconceived notions that we have to kind of get rid of before we can actually commit to this scientific approach that is unbiased. So when you talk about art, it makes me think of the importance of incorporating emotion, maybe not incorporating, but embracing, acknowledging the fact that emotions play a big role in what we do as scientists as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always say to my students that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Science happens in a society, and science happens by people. It's done by people. And so I don't know, I'm not necessarily like a scientific historian / philosopher, so I don't really know how we got to this point where we've sort of internalized and tried to embody this like scientist as unbiased observer. I don't necessarily think that scientists are always unbiased observers. We try as hard as we can, but I think if we embraced the fact that we are not unbiased observers, then we might be able to do better science. Yeah, and I think that one of the ways that we do that is by engaging with these diverse voices, and like sort of thinking through what that means to do science, you know, in this era, which is very different than how science, you know, and again, I'm not a science historian, so actually I can't speak on this like with expertise, but it's very different than historically how science has been done during different periods. It's always changing. Yeah, and I also want to piggyback on that. There's a question in the chat about how designers and artists can learn from scientists, and I think that probably the most important way that designers and artists and creatives can learn from scientists is through actually the same sort of research method, scientific process, whatever, right? So while we're learning from designers, there is this element, all my students sort of learn in my classes like what it means to do scientific research, which is similar to artistic research, but also very different. In one critical way that it's different, is that scientists, I think, because we've internalized this like role as the unbiased observer, we tend to kind of try and look at all the available evidence, right? Everything that we possibly can get our hands on. That's why scientific papers have like 60 citations, you know? And so I think artists are really learning about that process through collaboration with scientists. I also think there's a more practical thing in that my students and artists and creatives and designers in general just learn about scientific topics. You know, they learn about environmental disaster, Anthropocene, climate change, et cetera, from scientists. And so there's kind of like two points there.
Carl?
Hey, Mika, Great talk. I really loved it. I had a question because you made a lot of really strong arguments about why scientists and artists should collaborate. But in our grad student lunch, you mentioned about how we're very siloed in our own disciplines. And I was just curious what your thoughts on how to make those collaborations happen are.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good good question, and one that I don't know I have like a great answer for. One way that we can make those collaborations happen is with more money, more funding, and institutions, our government, funders, etc., need to make this a priority. I think they need to make this what I call radically interdisciplinary collaboration less radical and more normalized. So I do think money is like kind of a limiting factor here. I know especially artists are often not compensated well for their work, and I think they're used to doing these things ad hoc or sort of like for a discount. But I don't think that that's the way to approach this necessarily. There's also something else I was going to say to this, but now it slipped my mind. But I do think like these types of collaborations are possible. Sometimes it's just like as simple as talking to an artist and seeing where their head is at and collaborating with an artist. I obviously am in a very privileged position in that all of my students are artists, and so they come and talk to me, and there's, as you can see, there's a lot of work that they've done. There's a lot of work that, like the Jimi Hendrix remix, as I call it, Carbon Dioxide remix, was an independent project that my student did. Another student of mine who's really interested in techno music held a Zoom panel earlier in the spring where we talked to some techno producers and DJs about how techno music and climate change intersect, right? And so a lot of it is talking and with each other about these things. A lot of it is letting go of stereotypes and preconceived notions about what artists are, or if you're an artist, what scientists are. These types of things, yeah. So I don't know that there's an easy answer for it, but it's something that I'm like going to spend the rest of my career thinking about. So yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It's 2 o'clock, so we'll end there. We'll give another round of virtual applause for Dr. Tosca, and anyone's welcome to join us at the post discussion in 5 or so minutes.
Thank you.